One characteristic of a responsible individual is that they fulfill their duties and expectations. That's part of those. As I said earlier on Monday, um, responsibility has three different factors to it, and in this particular instance, I want to spend some time talking about the individual who fulfills their duties and expectations. They are dependable. They are reliable in that way. Let's say you receive a good performance review. You receive a good performance review when you meet or exceed the company's expectations. So I'm wondering, could the same thing be said about our spiritual lives? Could the same thing be said about our spiritual lives? Well, we'll examine that today as we explore some scriptures to see what the scriptures have to say about all of that. I'll be back in just a moment. You're watching Transforming the World, and my name is Pastor Greg. There's a classic example that comes out of the book of Esther. Um, I'm not sure how much you know about the story of Esther. She was a Jewish girl who was still living in Persia, even though their people had been permitted to go back to their land. A lot of the Jewish people ended up going back to the nation of Israel, back to Jerusalem. They were rebuilding the city. But there were some Jewish individuals who remained in Persia. Nehemiah was one of them, for example. Daniel stayed in Persia, even though there was a lot of people that went back to Israel. And Esther and her cousin Mordecai, for example, they stayed in Persia as well. Well, so while they're living in Persia, why the king happens to take notice of this girl, Esther. She must have been very attractive and caught the king's eye, and liked her so much that eventually King Artaxerxes makes Esther the queen. Esther chapter 2, verse 17. Now, although these Jewish people were no longer captives, their nation had been they had been set free from captivity. They were still under Persian rule. So the nation of Israel was all part of this Persian empire, if you will. And Artaxerxes was the king, the ruler over all that region, all these different nations. It's a lot different than from the way Babylon functioned. For example, Babylon took people captive, but in the Persian Empire and then later on in the Roman Empire, you became part of a kingdom. And you were allowed to live back in your land, but you just, the Persian king was your ruler. So, because of some trickery, why King Artaxerxes ends up passing a decree that said that all of these Jewish people were going to be killed on such and such date. March 7th, 473 BC is when it was supposed to happen. Well, eventually, Esther's cousin, Mordecai, he points out that, Esther, look, you're queen. You're the queen in Persia. And yet you're Jewish. Is it possible that God put you in that place for this specific reason? As he points out, she became queen for such a time as this, Esther 4:14. There was a tremendous risk for Esther, yet she knew her responsibility and knew the risk and went through with it anyway, recognizing that she was there for a purpose and she was there for a reason, and it was her responsibility, or her reliability to fulfill that. So in our lives as Christians, there may come a moment when you and I are going to need to do a whole lot more than simply worship the Lord on Sunday. There actually may come a time when we need to stand up for what is right. There might come a time in our life as a Christian when we have to... do you ever see Lord of the Rings? There's a really neat scene there where Gandalf in Lord of the Rings stares at evil. He stares evil down and says, "You shall not pass." And there sometimes in our responsibilities as a Christian, we may end up having to move out of our comfort zone because our voice needs to be heard, much like Queen Esther. She had a responsibility to speak up on behalf of the Jewish people. And there are sometimes, I believe, even today, that we Christians have a responsibility to speak up. Our voice needs to be heard. Let me ask you this question. Is there conflict where you work? Do you think the Lord put you there for such a time as this? Is somebody at school being bullied? Do you think God revealed the situation to you because you are a voice for dignity and love? That He put you there for such a time as this? Have you ever observed dishonesty and deception? You, who know that it is wrong, should never look away and remain silent. Perhaps God has placed you in a situation because He expects you to do the responsible thing. Our responsibility is to God. Our responsibility is to do what is right. Our responsibility is to be a voice of what is good and right in this world. Our responsibility is to make a difference in the world in which we live, to not sit idly by while the world is falling apart all around us. We have a responsibility to stand up, speak up for what is right and for what is good. Our responsibility is not to sit in a church on a Sunday morning and lift our hands in praise. Our responsibility, the responsibility God has given you and me, is to be an ambassador, if you will, an ambassador for Christ. That we speak on behalf of Jesus Christ. We act, we serve, we give, we love, we lift up those who have fallen down, all in the name of Jesus Christ. That's our responsibility. So the question for you today is, has God placed you in a situation where you need to speak up? Has God placed you in a situation where you need to stand up for what is right? Has God put you there for such a time as this? Do the responsible thing. Well, thank you, my friend, for spending time with me today. We'll continue our discussion of this Christian characteristic tomorrow. In the meantime, my name is Pastor Greg. You're watching Transforming the World.